I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm sure most of you are already familiar with this, but Madison is home to the annual world's largest Brat Fest. It's a weekend-long festival. It's got food and games and music and all these things, and most importantly, a truly ridiculous amount of bratwurst that gets sold to people. And when I was growing up there, this started in the early 80s, and it goes on every year. When I was growing up there, every single year the Bratfest would try to break the world record for a number of brats sold at one place in one weekend. And every single year they broke the record. So I was growing up and listening to the news every year that would say, 165,000 brats sold, new world record, 185,000 brats sold, new world record. And I grew sort of accustomed to it, such that it wasn't that big a deal to me anymore that we were breaking records every single year in the Bratfest. And I was thinking about that on the flight out here because I sort of feel the same way about the solar market in the US, which is that we keep repeating that we're breaking new records, but I've become sort of accustomed to it and a little bit inoculated to how impressive it really is. So I'm trying to regain my childish excitement about solar in the US, and it's not that hard to do. This year, we're going to install about 6.5 gigawatts of PV in the US. That's up 36% over 2013. That equates to about a $16 billion market. That's $16 billion that are going to flow into solar projects in the US this year. In honor of Bill Walton coming, I looked it up, and that's equivalent to the combined market value of the top 20 NBA teams. So the solar market is about the size of the top 20 NBA teams combined this year, which is a really big number. And perhaps most importantly, so far this year, solar has comprised about 35% of all new electricity generating capacity installed in the US. More than a third of all the new capacity that has come online in the US has been solar. Solar is second only to natural gas under that metric. So we have a great year that we're just closing out right now that was preceded by 14 years of growth before it. We have this really consistent, significant annual growth that we've been seeing in the US solar market, and that is something to be very proud of if we're looking backward. We also have an increasingly diverse market landscape where the US solar market used to be really just California and then a smattering of other small states, and then for a while it was California and New Jersey and a smattering of other small states. We have seen a fair amount of geographic diversification in the solar market in the US, and so we have a lot more interesting, meaningfully sized state solar markets now than we ever have in the past. We started tracking with SEIA the solar market on a quarterly basis in early 2010, and at the time we were tracking 20 states. And when we came up with the initial list, it was easy to find 12 or 13 that we thought we needed to cover, and then we were really pushing it to try to get those last 8 or so, because there were just 10 states that had anything going on. Now we're tracking 30 states, 31 states actually, and we keep being forced to add more because new states open up. With that said, it's still a pretty highly concentrated market. This year, the top 5 states for solar installations in the US should install about 74% of all the solar in the US. So we're still reliant on a few key states, obviously California being the biggest one, but also Massachusetts, New Jersey, Arizona, Nevada. Take those states away, or take any one of those states away, and it has an outsized impact on the market overall. Still, I think we have a lot to be proud of here. This is a lot of growth that we have seen, increasing geographic diversification. These are all things we've been looking for in terms of the evolution and the maturation of the solar market in the US. But as we think toward the future, I think if we look at how the market has been growing, it basically has been growing under a single paradigm since its inception. And that paradigm comes in 2 parts. And they both have to do with incentives. The first is the federal incentive, the investment tax credit. 99% of all solar operating in the US today has taken advantage of a 30% investment tax credit. And second, and a little bit more amorphously, but just as importantly, comes state level incentives. If you look out across all market segments for solar in the US, across all installations that have taken place to date, about 92% of them benefited from some form of a state level incentive. So we've had various different kinds of state level incentives in the history of the solar market here. We've had rebates, production-based incentives, SRECs, renewable portfolio standards, feed-in tariffs of one kind or another, many different forms, but ultimately serving to improve the economics of solar in that state. Almost all solar that has been installed has taken advantage of and basically needed to take advantage of some form of a state-level incentive. That 8% that hasn't taken advantage of a state-level incentive generally comes in one of two forms. That's either installations that have taken place just over the last year, particularly in California, outside the California Solar Initiative, or it's a few individual utility scale projects with power purchase agreements from municipal utilities that didn't have a mandate to procure, but procured anyway. So generally speaking, the market has been driven by stacking a federal incentive on top of a state incentive. And the reason why I think that's important is that times are changing. First, on the ITC, as I'm sure all of you know, the ITC is scheduled to drop from 30% to 10% for a commercial system or a third-party owned residential system, and to 0% for a host-owned residential system on January 1st, 2017. So we are now basically 2 years away from the scheduled expiration of the ITC. It may be extended, and I'm sure most of the solar industry hopes that it will be extended. SEIA is going to be working very hard to extend it. But if you're doing business planning right now, you can't rely upon that. So you have to be thinking about what happens if the ITC does expire as currently planned. So first, the ITC is coming to its end, potentially. And second, broadly speaking, state-level incentives are in decline. They're not gone, certainly, and there have been actually a few cases of new valuable state-level incentives introduced in the last couple of years. The New York Sun program is probably the best example of that, a big, new, meaningful incentive program that created a whole new state market where there was a very small one before. But I think if you look out across all the states that have incentive programs, they are generally declining over time. Certainly it's been true in California, as it was designed to be. In other states, you have, say, SREC markets where the SREC values have been declining over time. And even when state-level incentives aren't in decline, oftentimes they serve to provide something of an artificial constraint on market growth. In that, there is often limited funding availability for whatever incentive there is, and so the market grows up to the availability of that funding and then stops growing. It's not a sustainable way to keep growing, ultimately, in the market to be totally reliant on these state-level incentives. Fortunately, we have kind of a countervailing force occurring at the same time, which is that solar is getting cheaper and cheaper, and in fact now is cheaper than it's ever been in the past. As of the third quarter of this year, the average residential solar installation price across the country was about $360 a watt. Non-residential, which is an aggregate of commercial, industrial, nonprofit, schools, government installations altogether, about $227 a watt, and utility scale systems about $168 a watt. There's a lot of variability within that, obviously, and I think most importantly, there are installers and developers and EPCs who can beat these numbers somewhat meaningfully. For example, best in class, all-in installation prices, including margins, I should note. These days, you can get a residential installation done in some places for under $3 a watt. You can get a commercial installation done in the US for under $2 a watt. And you can do utility scale for something in the range of $150. So, solar is the cheapest that it has ever been, and the trend line continues to look downward. So prices are only going to go down for solar. So these are two things that are sort of fighting against each other, right? Solar is getting cheaper, which should open up the market. Meanwhile, incentives that have been the bedrock of demand, generally speaking, either are in decline or look to potentially decline precipitously in a couple of years. So if you're a firm like ours and you're trying to make sense of where the market is going to head, how do you think about where growth will occur, how fast will it occur, and when, in the context of these two forces battling against each other? Well, the traditional way to do it would be grid parity analysis. So basically what you do is you estimate the cost of solar on a levelized cost of energy basis. That's in dollars per kilowatt hour. You compare that up against the retail price of electricity. At some point, those two lines cross each other. That's your grid parity mark, and that tells you that there's a market there. We've generally shied away from doing grid parity analysis like that in the past for a couple of reasons that I think are worth kind of fleshing out. The first is that If all you're doing is comparing the cost of solar to the cost of retail electricity, you're missing out on what is increasingly becoming the most important driver and potential barrier of at least residential solar, commercial solar in a lot of cases as well in the US, which is rate structures. In reality, most customers who have residential solar aren't able to reduce their bill at the full retail electricity price. They have some fixed charge on their bill that solar doesn't decrease. On the commercial level, customers generally have a fixed charge and potentially a demand charge as well that solar isn't guaranteed to reduce as well. So the reality is that if you compare solar up against retail electricity prices, you're often making solar look misleadingly competitive. And so I can give you an example of that. Let's just take a customer in Connecticut. So this is a residential customer in Connecticut Light and Power territory. I use Connecticut because customers with the primary tariff and CL&P territory have a pretty big fixed charge. It's a $16 a month fixed charge on their bill. And what you're looking at here is a way that we've devised to sort of calculate when grid parity will hit. Basically, the metric is year one net savings to the customer from solar. If it's positive above the line, that means you're not getting savings from solar. It means you're not at grid parity yet. If it's below zero, you've exceeded grid parity. So this is what it would look like if you compare the cost of solar in any given year up against the full retail price of electricity. And this is not incorporating any state level incentives, which Connecticut does actually have. So this would be a really positive story, because you'd be saying, well, okay, in next year, we're basically getting to the point where we've hit grid parity. We will exceed it in 2016. We'll have a blip in 2017 when the ITC reduces, but then we'll get back there. And basically, Connecticut's in the money from there on out. Lots of homeowners in Connecticut, lots of homeowners who can afford to go solar with unobstructed south or west facing roofs. Great, Connecticut should be a huge market to the extent that it can be. The problem is, in reality, if you actually incorporate the impact of the fixed charge on customer bills in CL&P territory, things look significantly different. It doesn't have an enormous impact on the overall economics, but what it does is push back that point of grid parity or the point of economic competitiveness for solar in that territory by years when you incorporate the actual fixed charge that is on the customer bill. And so you end up with an analysis that shows you false parity in the meantime. So this has always been kind of a barrier for us because it's really, it's easy to do a simple grid parity analysis. It's really hard to deal with rate structures. They're so complex, they're customer specific and utility specific. So we've spent a while, the past few months, trying to build out a model that we think actually does incorporate this and then allows us to really start to develop a nuanced view on how the market is going to evolve over the next few years and when it's going to start to open up in states that you won't expect. So brief aside into the methodology that we used in the analysis that I'm about to show you. Apologies if this gets a little bit wonky. Feel free to tune me out for the next 30 seconds or so. So here's what we do. First we have to model out the cost of solar, the levelized cost of electricity. This part is pretty standard. We have our own proprietary LCOE model, but many others do. There are many public LCOE models as well. We do it for one representative customer, and I will show you the results that are specific to residential, but you could do this just as easily for commercial. We do it for one representative customer in the biggest utility territory in each of all 50 states. And we model out the levelized cost of electricity, including our own inputs for system costs that are region-specific, financing costs, and other things like that, with the radiation data from NREL. Then, we have to do the harder part, which is estimating the actual impact on a customer's bill that installing solar will have. So we take an hourly load profile from OpenEI and an hourly PV production profile from PV Watts and plug both of those into GenAbility, which, if you don't know, it's a great partnership. They're very kind to let us use their tool, actually incorporates the real impact of real rate structures for real customers. So that gets us to, for this representative customer, what are they avoiding on their bill via solar? Compare those up against each other, and I think you have something a little bit more meaningful in terms of whether solar is economically competitive. And then, of course, we have to forecast that forward, generally using our own forecast for system prices and financing costs, but also incorporating what potential increases there may be in electricity prices, the comparative metric for customers based on EIA forecasts there. So this is what we do. And what I'd like to show you is some of the preliminary results that we have from this. But one caveat ahead of time, which is that I have a personal pet peeve of people getting up on stage and presenting the results of some complex model, and you have no idea whether all the inputs make any sense, and you can't really vet it yourself. So what we're going to do in this case is, after this session is over, we're going to send an email out to all of you that will include an attachment of the slides as well as a spreadsheet that has all of the inputs, all the load profile information, all the cost inputs, everything that you need to be able to take a look at it yourself. And feel free to send us a note, because we're still working on this and we'd love to get feedback. There's a second problem with the sort of traditional grid parity analysis, which is I personally don't think grid parity is that important a point in time. Right? If I go to you and you're a homeowner and I say, I can offer you solar today, and I can give it to you with a 20-year power purchase agreement, and that power purchase agreement is going to be at exactly the same rate that your electricity currently costs you. And it'll have an escalator that is a little bit less than historical increases in electricity prices year over year. I don't think that's all that exciting to most homeowners. We don't actually have to reach grid parity to open up a solar market. We have to do better than that. Right? The point that actually matters is the point where the customer is enticed by the savings from solar. Certainly there's a kind of hedging value of just having solar anyway, but I don't think that's what drives market growth for the most part. So the question then is, what is if you're going to have to pick a point, what is the point that is more meaningful? We spent a lot of time trying to figure that out as well, and based on conversations with installers and finance providers and some of the data in the market, we've landed on 10% net year one savings. Can you go to a customer and say, we can save you 10% on your electricity bill today with a 20-year contract that's going to stay fixed or remain below historical increases in electricity prices? So what we're looking for is not just grid parity, we're looking for something like a tipping point where a market really begins to open up. One caveat here, which is we assume no state-level incentives in the analysis that we've been doing here. In reality, there are state-level incentives. There are lots of state-level incentives. Many states still have rebates in place. Certainly SREC markets, you can get value from those SRECs. There are many ways to derive additional value from a system beyond just the cash flow from the customer and the ITC. But I do think it's important to look at the market, particularly as you start to build it out a few years, absent state-level incentives, for a couple of reasons. One, as I said before, state-level incentives, even where they exist, if you're totally reliant on them, they can provide an artificial constraint, so the market only grows so much. And second, there are a lot of states that have meaningful potential for solar that just don't have a state-level incentive and may not for the next few years, but may open up as solar markets as solar gets cheaper and cheaper. So the question is when. And the way to look at that is compare every state on an apples-to-apples basis, no state-level incentives, but all incorporating the ITC. So having done all of that, here's where we end up for 2014. Gray means you're not near the tipping point yet. You're not near grid parity yet. Green, which you haven't seen yet, means you're approaching grid parity, but can't quite offer the customer savings yet. Blue means we've exceeded grid parity. We've hit grid parity, but you can't yet offer the customer 10% savings. So in our parlance, you're not yet at the tipping point. And black means you are at the tipping point. So where we stand in 2014 is that we have 3 states that have already exceeded the tipping point: California, Arizona, and Hawaii. We have 4 more states that arguably have hit grid parity and not yet hit that tipping point. Again, without state-level incentives. So this is interesting, I think, because it does actually reflect a reality in the market today, which is in California, the vast majority of all residential solar installations now take place outside any state-level incentive program. The California Solar Initiative has largely expired for residential customers, and yet the market continues to grow. So far this year, almost 3/4 of all residential solar took advantage of no state-level incentive in California. That's kind of proof positive that California has hit that point. That, I think, is relatively common knowledge if you're operating in California. You may not know it's also generally true in Arizona thus far this year. More than 50% of all residential installations in Arizona so far this year taken advantage of no state level incentive. So Arizona similarly has largely hit that point already. Hawaii is its own beast. The economics of solar in Hawaii are fantastic. There are state level incentives. You don't really need them, but they help, especially as rate structures change and net energy metering changes in Hawaii, which will definitely happen over the next few years. The other one that's interesting to point out, I think, is New Jersey. So New Jersey is an example of a state that does have an incentive. It has a renewable portfolio standard that's pretty aggressive, and as a result, it has tradable certificates called SRECs. And SRECs have been the biggest driver of growth in the New Jersey market, and why New Jersey has historically been in the top 2 or 3 state markets for solar in the country. But what we've seen in New Jersey is divergent dynamics between the commercial market there, which remains highly reliant on SREC prices, and the residential market, which increasingly doesn't. So over time, what has happened in the commercial market, which is the blue line here, is a very clear boom-bust cycle. It actually hasn't been the cleanest boom-bust, but that's been what has happened. The New Jersey market for commercial solar exploded. SRECs became highly oversupplied. SREC prices crashed. The New Jersey commercial market crashed and reached a new low, actually, in Q3 of this year. Meanwhile, the residential market during that time has been a lot smaller historically, but has been steadily and basically incrementally, consistently growing throughout that same time. So as SREC prices were plummeting and the commercial market was in turmoil, the residential market just kind of kept plodding along, such that in the third quarter of this year, for the first time in recent history, we saw more residential solar installed in New Jersey than commercial solar. This is, to me, a pretty clear indicator that the residential market in New Jersey is not nearly as reliant on SREC prices and thus state-level incentives, which speaks to why New Jersey looks pretty good in this analysis. So that's 2014. Let's skip ahead a couple of years and look at 2016 ahead of ITC expiration. Things get really kind of interesting here. Right? You have a bunch more states that have hit the tipping point. Nevada, New Mexico, and New Jersey are all there. You have a number of other states that are basically hitting the grid parity mark, not yet able to offer a customer significant savings. And I think what you can say about that is you may have some small market growth, installers who can install cheaper than we've got here, or have some cheaper financing, or customers who are particularly attractive. So you will start to see a market pick up a little bit, but not in the same kind of a booming fashion that you might see if you were already at the tipping point. You could see an insurgence of new solar installers entering those states. The other thing you can say about this is that a small incentive in one of these states will go a long way. So you can have a little bit of an incentive and open up a big market, which isn't going to be true everywhere. So what's exciting to me about 2016 as you look at this is there are a bunch of states on here that where the economics actually look pretty good when you model it all out that do not have much of a solar market today. So you probably don't anticipate that Wyoming is going to be a big solar market in 2016, but it could be a relatively attractive one. Michigan, same thing. Basically all of New England starts to look pretty good. These are meaningful opportunities over the next couple of years, and I do think that you will start to see the companies that are out there seeking new markets start to enter some of these states in 2015, maybe early 2016, and start to see a market develop there totally independent of state-level incentive programs. So that's exciting about 2016, but of course, then comes the cliff. We hit the end of 2016. If the ITC is not extended, then it drops on January 1st, 2017. So what happens then? Basically, we revert back largely to where we are today. So the economics, generally speaking, in 2017 for residential solar to us look a lot like they look in 2014. That may sound like it's not such a big deal, right? We haven't killed the market entirely, and certainly that's true, but keep in mind that 2016 is going to look really big. So we're going to be seeing 2 more years of meaningful growth in the market, followed by a market that looks a lot more similar to today than it does to 2016. So that will feel somewhat painful. The other, I think, point here that's sort of unfortunate about what will happen when the ITC expires is that sort of blossoming that I just showed you in 2016, the next couple of years where you're going to see a bunch of states open up as meaningful solar markets, that's what you lose because so many of those states are right at the margin of economic competitiveness. So those states that just started to open up, all of a sudden the ITC declines, it's hard to get there. And this is incorporating a lower cost of capital in a post-ITC world. You could make an argument that solar will get cheaper faster than we project, but regardless, I think the biggest impact in the residential market in particular, and the commercial market as well, to ITC reduction is just a retreat back to the states that are already strong solar markets where the economics are best. And the geographic diversification we will be seeing will be somewhat lost for a bit. Also, while I'm on the topic of ITC expiration, I think I'd be remiss just to talk about the residential market in this case, because while there will certainly be an impact on the residential and commercial solar markets, they won't be eviscerated, right? There will still be a residential market to speak of in 2017, commercial as well. It will take a hit, but it will exist, and there will be states that still make sense. Utility scale solar is somewhat of a different story, and there's kind of an easy way to show how that looks today. Over the next 2 years, we have about 13 gigawatts of utility scale PV with a power purchase agreement already in place, planning to begin commercial operation either in 2015 or 2016. That is a huge pipeline that is largely going to get built out. These are generally pretty real projects. And in fact, there are going to be some that aren't even on this list yet. So we have at least 13 gigawatts to build out in the next 2 years. It's going to look like a huge boom for utility scale solar in the US. On the other hand, there's less than a gigawatt of projects that are planning to begin commercial operation in 2017. This is not because it's 3 years out. This is because almost no one is planning to build a utility scale solar project in the US to have it begin operation in 2017. And in fact, in the cases where developers have signed PPAs that begin after 2017, many of them are still planning to bring the project online in 2016 and then have to figure out a way to bridge the time between the project beginning operation and the PPA beginning. So they're doing that in a number of ways. A merchant knows, a bridge PPA. But regardless, it speaks to the serious impact that ITC reduction will have on utility scale solar, more so than on distributed solar. And the reason for that is just that utility scale solar is operating under the need to be really, really cheap right now, because it's not entirely driven by renewable portfolio standards anymore. Now, utility scale solar has started to win bids against other technologies, against wind and natural gas. It's started to win based on Ppa rules, if you're familiar with that. But that's reliant on really low PPA prices, which we can get now with the ITC included. So PPA prices for utility scale solar that have been signed this year are pretty consistently now in the $45 to $65 a megawatt hour range. That's down a lot. You can see it's a steady, serious decline. It's actually a more rapid decline in utility scale PPA prices on a percentage basis than we have seen in system prices. So there's been a ton of innovation in driving down those costs, but you can only get to those kind of numbers, at least right now, with the ITC in place. So where the ITC will have an impact on distributed solar, I think utility scale solar is really where it's going to be felt the most. And it's going to look more like what we saw with the expiration of the PTC in the wind market. So with that said, back to what happens, because the market doesn't end in 2017, obviously. We retreat to markets that are most attractive or to markets where state level incentives are strong and have picked up. But obviously the market would continue to go on after that. So let's skip ahead again a few more years to 2020. And this is where things really start to get exciting. We actually don't have particularly aggressive assumptions for how far solar costs will fall. We're talking about residential solar that is still above $2 a watt here in 2020. And that results in levelized cost of energy for those projects that can range from something like 9 cents a kilowatt hour up to 14 or 15 depending on what state you're talking about. But that actually alone, if you incorporate what electricity prices are going to look like at that time, opens up a lot of states. Here we have 28 states that have hit grid parity, 14 of which have already hit that tipping point. If you just sort of are trying to think about how that impacts the addressable market for solar at that time, well, if you look at total rooftop suitability in those 28 states based on some research that NREL has done, it's roughly 100 gigawatts of addressable residential solar market in those 28 states. That's as compared to a residential market this year that is going to be a grand total of about 1.2 gigawatts. So the addressable market for solar in 2020, just for residential, is about 100 times the size that the market is today. That gets really exciting. And there are a lot of states on there where there is very little, if any, meaningful solar market today, but plenty of homeowners who would be happy to go solar if they could. So 2020 is where things really start to get exciting, and that's just not that far off. That's 5 years away. In the meantime, we have a lot of work to do to sort of get over bumps that will arise from a variety of places. But assuming we can hit our cost targets and keep the market growing during this time, things get really exciting in a few years. That said, there's one thing that we don't include in this analysis that, as I mentioned before, increasingly is more important, at least in my mind, than almost anything else, and that is changing electricity rate structures. So, what you've seen over the past couple of years, generally speaking, is utilities in various states popping up and trying to make changes either to net energy metering specifically, and increasingly now just changes to customer rate structures that generally serve the purpose to increase fixed charges on customer bills. We now have a case in SRP territory in Arizona where the utility not only wants to do that, but also wants to institute a residential demand charge. These things all hurt the economics of solar generally. And so as those changes get made, it totally changes the picture here of when solar becomes economic where. And unfortunately, my home state of Wisconsin provides a perfect example of how that plays out. So in Wisconsin, if you've been following these rate structure battles, the Wisconsin 3 investor-owned utilities all recently proposed similar rate structure revisions, increases in fixed charges, solar-specific charges, reductions in the volumetric charge as a result. And though in most states, at least thus far, utilities that have proposed something like that have failed or have had to significantly compromise, the Wisconsin utilities basically got what they asked for. And so we modeled this out for a residential customer in We Energy's territory, which is Milwaukee area. It's the biggest utility in Wisconsin. And here's what it looked like for a customer with a $9 fixed charge on the bill, which is what exists today prior to the changes that We Energies has recently had approved. Again, with no state level incentives, Wisconsin gets pretty close to hitting grid parity in the next couple of years, certainly gets there by the end of this forecast period. Wisconsin has very little solar market at this point, so it's exciting to sort of see that it might develop one over the next couple of years. But what happens when you increase the fixed charge from $9 to $16 a month and decrease the volumetric rate as a result, as We Energy is proposed to do? You basically set it back about 5 years, which makes for unhappy cheeseheads. That's meaningful. I mean, that does, it tells you that there could be a solar market that opened up in Wisconsin, which I would have been ecstatic about. And instead, it probably isn't going to happen, at least not in the near term, unless state level incentives are introduced. And that's purely as a result of these rate structure changes. Wisconsin is certainly not going to be the only place that has something like this happen, and it's going to be different everywhere, but this is what we're going to be monitoring and trying to update this model to see what kind of an impact it has on the economics and the tipping point in any given state. So assuming that rate structure revisions don't kill the market, and assuming that there's still net metering in place and everything looks roughly like it does today, here's where you get to. So with states that are in the money without state level incentives, by 2016 there's 14 of them, 6 of which are at the tipping point already, 8 of which have hit the grid parity mark and not yet hit that tipping point. We drop down in 2017 with the ITC expiration and then build that back up such that in 2020 you end up with, like I said, 28 states that are in the money in one form or another, at grid parity, at the tipping point. That's an exciting trend for me. That really does mean that there is significant growth to be had here. But as I've shown in the states where we looked at specific examples, it's the margins are tight. And so this is why things like cost reductions matter. This is why financial innovation matters. This is why the regulatory battles that are happening matter, because any given thing, if it doesn't go quite right, can push a meaningful portion of the market out of the money. Finally, I think a lot of times in the solar industry, we have a tendency to talk about solar in a vacuum. Solar is its own market, it is its own thing. It largely is sold as a single offering. And we, at Green Tech Media have been spending a lot of time over the past year, as Scott mentioned, building out this Grid Edge program, which is about the evolution of the utility customer dynamic. And I think the overarching trend over the next 5 or 10 years is going to be customer empowerment. And solar is a linchpin of that, right? The empowered electricity customer, to the extent that they can, they're going to have solar on their roof. If they can't have solar on their roof, they probably will be bought into community solar or crowd-funded solar. Maybe they'll buy a Solar City bond. There's opportunities now for almost anybody to get involved in solar in one way or another. But also in their home, there's increasingly opportunity for them to have a number of other things. They can have a really clever home energy management system. Maybe it's a Nest thermostat, which is what this sort of bastardized version looks like. Or they may have residential energy storage eventually. They may have an electric vehicle with a charging station. Maybe that serves as energy storage as well or instead. Maybe they get to start participating in residential demand response. And increasingly, I think over time, the empowered customer is going to see solar as part of a more holistic thing. A lot of people will just install solar and that's it. But for a lot of people, this is going to be one cohesive change to the way that they interact with the grid. And the challenge for both the solar industry and everybody who's in all these adjacent industries as well is to figure out how to integrate all these things together and to do so in a manner that is simple to the customer. If I'm an electricity customer, all I want is you to say, okay, I'm going to do all these things for you. And at the end of the day, your iPhone app is going to tell you how much you save, and you don't need to do a whole lot more. That's pretty tricky as all these things change, especially including tariff structures and things like that. So the challenge is in simplicity and clarity for customers as we're developing a connected home as opposed to just solar alone. So to close out, I looked up the stats because I was curious. The Madison, Wisconsin Brat Fest peaked at 210,000 brats sold in one weekend in 2010. That's about 1 brat per capita in Madison. And I was there that year, actually, so I was one among those 210,000 brats. But unfortunately, it peaked there and then has been in decline ever since. We're down to, I think last year was 165,000 brats sold, which is the same as it was back in the mid-90s. I wish I knew more about the bratwurst market to be able to tell you why that's true. But it is an indicator that just because things grow for a long time, that was consistent growth in the Bratfest from 1984 to 2010, doesn't mean they're always going to. And so, in the solar market, there's a lot of work to be done here. And like I said, we're operating with extraordinary potential and really tight margins. And that's why I'm personally really excited for all the conversations that are going to happen here over the next couple of days, because they are all ultimately about how to figure out ways, innovations that are technological, market-driven, business model-driven, financially driven, to maintain growth within the solar market despite whatever countervailing forces may come our way. So with that, thank you very much, and I will hand it over to Stephen Lacey for the Energy Gang Live podcast. Thank you.